The past is not a fixed point. It is a signal, degrading over time, buried under layers of static and new data. As we dig through the archives of the analog age, we occasionally find artifacts that defy the standard decay. We find moments where the signal did not just fade, but was forcibly overridden. Welcome to the archive. I am your guide through the noise. Today, we are tuning our receivers back to a very specific frequency in time and space. We are looking at late November 1977. The location is the southern coast of the United Kingdom. The medium is the cathode ray tube. To understand the anomaly, we must first understand the baseline reality it invaded. Saturday, November 26th, 1977. It was a cold evening in Hampshire and Berkshire. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the damp, terraced streets in darkness. Inside the homes of the region, the glow of the television set was the hearth of the modern age. At this point in history, television was not a stream of endless choice. It was a communal, synchronized experience. There were only 3 channels available in the UK. The act of watching was a ritual. Families gathered at specific times, their attention captured by the same flickering images that their neighbors watched next door. This synchronization is important. It means that when the reality of the broadcast fractured, it fractured for thousands of people simultaneously. The time was 5:10 in the evening. On the Independent Broadcasting Authority network, specifically the Southern Television region, the program scheduled was the early evening news. The bulletin was produced by ITN, Independent Television News. The anchor for the evening was Andrew Gardner. Gardner was a veteran broadcaster, a man with a face and voice that projected stability and authority. He wore the standard suit and tie of the era. He sat behind a desk that represented the center of the world's information flow. To the viewer, Gardner was the arbiter of truth. The bulletin began as any other. The headlines of the day were mundane, grounding the audience in the geopolitical friction of the late 70s. There were reports on the economy, on the civil unrest in Rhodesia, on the slow, grinding gears of government. The signal originated from the Hannington transmitter, a towering steel mast situated on the North Hampshire Downs. This transmitter beamed the UHF signal across a wide swath of the South, covering parts of Hampshire, Berkshire, and seemingly quiet rural towns. At approximately 5:11 p.m., the stability of that signal began to erode. It did not begin with a bang or a sudden cut to black. The intrusion was far more insidious because it was gradual. First, there was a visual disturbance. The picture on thousands of television sets began to wobble. The image of Andrew Gardner reading the news jittered, losing its vertical hold. The colors bled slightly. the sharp lines of the studio dissolving into a soft, analog fuzz. For the viewers sitting on their shag carpets and velvet sofas, this was a common annoyance. Atmospheric interference, a loose wire, a problem at the station. It was tech, not terror. But then the audio shifted. The familiar, clipped, professional tones of the news anchor faded. They were not cut off, rather, they were submerged. A deep, oscillating hum began to rise in the mix. It was a sound described by witnesses as a rhythmic buzzing, similar to a heavy generator or a large tuning fork struck in a cavern. The visual feed of the news continued. Andrew Gardner was still there. His mouth was moving. He was shuffling papers. He was looking into the camera. But the words coming out of the television speakers no longer matched the man on the screen. The hum stabilized, and a voice emerged from the static. This is the primary artifact of the event. The voice. It was not the harsh, robotic cadence of a primitive synthesizer, nor was it the frantic, shouting voice of a political radical hijacking the airwaves for a manifesto. The voice was calm. It was remarkably, unsettlingly polite. It possessed a strange, hollow quality, as if speaking through a long metal pipe, with a slight, electronic echo tailing the ends of the sentences. It sounded male, though stripped of the emotional variance usually found in human speech. The accent was difficult to place. Some heard a distinct received pronunciation, the Queen's English, but flattened. Others recall it sounding vaguely transatlantic or artificial, like a computer attempting to mimic a British dialect. The message began. This is the voice of Vrillon, a representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command, speaking to you. The sentence hung in the living rooms of southern England. On the screen, Andrew Gardner continued to read the news, oblivious. The disconnect between sight and sound created a cognitive dissonance, a dreamlike state for the viewer. The authority figure was visually present, but his voice had been usurped by an entity claiming extraterrestrial origin. The voice continued, maintaining that steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic pace. For many years, you have seen us as lights in the skies. We speak to you now in peace and wisdom, as we have done to your brothers and sisters all over this, your planet Earth. The transmission was not a threat. It was a sermon. The technical sophistication required to achieve this override is a detail we will analyze deeply later. But in the moment, the effect was total. The hijacker had successfully captured the FM audio subcarrier. This meant they had overpowered the audio signal being sent to the Hannington transmitter, while leaving the video signal relatively intact, though distorted. The audio engineer at Southern Television, sitting in a control room miles away, would have seen the audio meters redlining or dropping. But the source was bypassing their local loop. The station was broadcasting the news, but the transmitter on the hill was singing a different song. The voice of Vrillon spoke for nearly 6 minutes. In the context of a broadcast hijacking, 6 minutes is an eternity. Most intrusions are seconds long, a shout of profanity, a quick image, a cut wire. This was a monologue. We come to warn you of the destiny of your race and your world, so that you may communicate to your fellow beings the course you must take to avoid the disaster which threatens your world and the beings on our worlds around you. The vocabulary was specific. It spoke of a new age. It spoke of dark forces. It was the lexicon of 1970s ufology and spiritualism, broadcast with military-grade signal strength. The sensory experience for the viewer shifted from confusion to unease. The picture of the newsroom occasionally distorted into a chaotic scramble of lines, then snapped back to clarity. At one point, during a video segment about a totally unrelated news story, the audio of Vrillon continued over footage of people walking down a street, or a politician getting into a car. This juxtaposition gave the message a haunting, documentary feel. It felt as if the alien voice was narrating the mundane activities of humanity, judging them from a great distance. This is in order that you may share in the Great Awakening, as the planet passes into the new age of Aquarius. The new age can be a time of great peace and evolution for your race, but only if your rulers are made aware of the evil forces that can overshadow their judgments. Be still now and listen, for your chance may not come again. The phrase, "be still now and listen," carries a biblical weight. It commands attention not through volume, but through authority. The families eating their dinners, the children waiting for the Saturday cartoons, the elderly watching the evening report, they were all held captive by this transmission. There was no way to change the channel to escape it, for the signal was dominating the local spectrum. Turning the volume down silenced the voice, but the silent, mouthing face of Andrew Gardner remained, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The broadcast continued to outline a philosophy of disarmament. This is a crucial element of the high strangeness of this event. Usually, a hoax is designed to shock, to offend, or to terrify. Or it is a prank designed to make people laugh. The Vrillon message did none of these things. It was earnest. It was pleading. All your weapons of evil must be removed. The time for conflict is now past, and the race of which you are a part may proceed to the higher stages of evolution if you show yourselves worthy to do so. You have but a short time to learn to live together in peace and goodwill. The specific phrasing, weapons of evil, rather than nuclear weapons or missiles, gave the speech a moral, almost mythological dimension. It framed the Cold War not as a political struggle, but as a spiritual failure. As the minutes ticked by, the confusion at the television station must have been absolute. Phone lines began to ring. Engineers scrambled to identify the source of the interference. But the Hannington transmitter was an unmanned relay station. It sat alone on the windy downs, humming with this foreign signal. There was no switch to flip, no person to call at the site to pull the plug. The intrusion had to run its course. Towards the end of the 6 minutes, the signal began to degrade. The override was losing power, or the source was moving, or the atmospheric conditions were shifting. "Do not fear," the voice said, as the static began to encroach upon the audio once again. "You will see more of our lights in the skies." The final moments of the transmission were perhaps the most surreal. As the voice of Vrillon faded, it did not abruptly cut back to the news. There was a transition period. The deep humming sound returned. The voice offered a final benediction. "We are now leaving the plains of your existence. May you be blessed by the supreme love and truth of the cosmos." And then silence. But not total silence. The audio of the television station began to bleed back in. However, the news bulletin had finished. The timing of the hijack had perfectly covered the remainder of the news segment. As the alien voice faded, the familiar, jaunty theme music of a Saturday evening cartoon began to play. The station, unaware of the content of the hijack, proceeded with its schedule. The screen cleared. The distortion vanished. And suddenly, the viewers were watching Looney Tunes. Imagine the psychological whiplash. One moment, a disembodied entity from the Ashtar Galactic Command is warning humanity about its spiritual destruction and the removal of weapons of evil. The next moment, a cartoon rabbit is hitting a cartoon duck with a mallet. The normality of the programming resumed instantly. There was no immediate apology from the station because, at the master control room in Southampton, they had not heard the message. They knew there was a glitch, a loss of sound, but they did not know that hundreds of thousands of people had just attended an interstellar sermon. For the viewers, the isolation was palpable. Had they just imagined it? Was it a play, a drama, or had something truly impossible just occurred? In the immediate aftermath, the phone lines of Southern television, the police, and local newspapers were jammed. The IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, was flooded with reports. People were terrified, not because the voice was scary, as we noted, it was calm, but because the sanctity of the broadcast had been violated. The television was the trusted source. It was the government in the corner of the room. For it to be possessed, even for 6 minutes, implied a vulnerability that the public was not ready to accept. We must look at the sensory details of that silence immediately following the broadcast. The ship if we are to call the transmission source a ship, left no radar trace. There was no sonic boom. There were no lights reported in the sky above the Hannington transmitter that night. The only physical evidence of the event was the magnetic alteration of the radio waves themselves. The incident was localized, yet massive. It happened in the quiet spaces of the evening, between the tea and the washing up. High strangeness often relies on the absurdity of the context. If this message had been received by a radio telescope at SETI, it would be the most important moment in human history, because it interrupted a local news report about the price of cocoa and labor unions. It was relegated to the realm of the bizarre, the prank, the glitch. But let us pause and consider the precision. To hijack a television signal in 1977 required more than a radio kit. It required a specific knowledge of the UHF frequency modulation used by the IBA. It required a power source capable of drowning out a professional transmitter that was pumping out kilowatts of energy. And it required the audacity to do it not for money, not for fame. The perpetrator never claimed responsibility, but to deliver a message of peace. The transmission of Vrillon stands as a unique moment in media history. It is a liminal broadcast. It exists on the threshold between technology and mythology. As the cartoon played on, and the laughter of the animated characters filled the silence left by the alien visitor, the people of southern England looked at each other in their living rooms. The spell was broken, but the atmosphere had changed. The air in the room felt different, charged. The screen was just a glass box again, but for 6 minutes it had been a window, and someone or something had looked through it. This was the incident, a rupture in the mundane, a signal from nowhere. In the next part of our analysis, we will strip away the mythology and look at the hard mechanics of the intrusion. We will examine the audio engineering required to fake such a signal, the investigations that followed, and the suspects who were hunted but never caught. We will ask the question, if this was a hoax, who had the capacity to pull it off? And more importantly, why was their message so desperate? But for now, let the words of the broadcast settle in the silence. Be still now and listen. The broadcast ended, but the mystery had just begun. The archive is open. The investigation continues. Part 2. The context. To understand the anomaly of November 26th, 1977, we must first dismantle the modern perception of digital connectivity. We live in an age where information is fluid, omnipresent, and easily manipulated. A hacked account or a deep-faked video is a nuisance, but it is an expected casualty of the internet age. But 1977 was different. It was an analog world. Information did not flow like water. It was carved into physical media. It was stamped onto vinyl, printed onto paper, or transmitted via massive, energy-intensive infrastructure. Television was not a service. It was an institution. In the United Kingdom, the broadcasting airwaves were held in a stranglehold by the state and a select few licensed contractors. To interrupt the signal of Southern television was not merely a prank. It was a violation of the sanctity of the public sphere. It was an intrusion into the collective consciousness of a nation. Let us examine the stage upon which this intrusion occurred. The year itself, 1977, was a period of profound liminality for Great Britain. It was the year of the Silver Jubilee, celebrating 25 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, a desperate attempt to project stability and tradition. Yet beneath the bunting and the street parties, the tectonic plates of culture were shifting. The economy was stagnating. Inflation was rampant. The political landscape was fracturing, leading toward the eventual winter of discontent. Culturally, the nation was caught between two worlds. On one side, the pastoral, comfortable conservatism represented by the Independent Broadcasting Authority, and the newsreaders who spoke in received pronunciation. On the other side, the raw, nihilistic scream of the Sex Pistols and the burgeoning punk movement, which demanded the destruction of the old order. And then, looking upward, there was the cosmos, the space-age optimism of the 1960s had curdled into Cold War paranoia, and a new brand of mysticism. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released in the United States just 10 days before the broadcast. Though it had not yet reached British cinemas, the cultural groundwater was already saturated with the concept of benign extraterrestrial contact. The public imagination was primed. The specific location of the event is equally important. The intrusion targeted the Hannington transmitter. Located on the crest of the North Hampshire Downs, the Hannington mast is a steel skeleton rising 125 meters into the gray English sky. It is a lonely structure. It stands amidst rolling farmland, far removed from the urban density of London. In 1977, this facility was a relay station. It did not originate its own signal. Instead, it acted as a mirror. It received the transmission from the main transmitter at Rowridge on the Isle of Wight, amplified it, and rebroadcast it to the televisions of Berkshire and North Hampshire. This technical architecture is the key to the mystery. It is the flaw in the armor that Vrillon, or the entity claiming that name, exploited. To understand how the voice of the Ashtar Galactic Command superimposed itself over the newsreader Andrew Gardner, we must delve into the physics of ultra-high frequency, or UHF, broadcasting. television signals in the 1970s were complex beasts. They consisted of two distinct components carried on the same frequency allocation. The visual component was an amplitude modulated signal, or AM. The audio component was a frequency modulated signal, or FM. This distinction is crucial. AM signals are additive. If two AM video signals collide on the same frequency, the result is a chaotic mess of ghosting, tearing, and visual noise. This is exactly what viewers saw. The video of the news anchor warped and distorted. It did not disappear. It was merely corrupted by the interference. FM signals, however, behave differently. They are subject to a phenomenon known in radio engineering as the capture effect. In FM transmission, the receiver, in this case, the thousands of television sets in living rooms across Hampshire, locks onto the strongest signal. It does not mix them. It chooses a victor. If a rogue signal is introduced on the same frequency and is sufficiently stronger than the original carrier, the receiver will instantly suppress the weaker signal and demodulate only the stronger one. It is a binary switch. One moment, you are hearing the station audio. The next, you are hearing the intruder. This tells us something profound about the perpetrator. They were not a casual vandal. They possessed a sophisticated understanding of radio propagation. They knew that to hijack the image would require massive power and complex synchronization equipment that would have been impossible to transport discreetly. But to hijack the audio, that only required a portable transmitter tuned precisely to the audio subcarrier of the Hannington relay and positioned close enough to the receiving antenna to overpower the signal coming from the Isle of Wight. The method implies a proximity to the Hannington mast. The geography suggests a lonely country lane, a parked van, and a heavy lead-acid battery powering a modified transmitter. The sheer logistical weight of this operation cannot be overstated. In 1977, electronics were heavy. There were no laptops, no software-defined radios. To build a UHF transmitter capable of overpowering a broadcast relay required distinct, bulky components: oscillators, amplifiers, cooling fins, and a power source. This equipment had to be sourced, assembled, tested, and transported without drawing attention in a rural community where strangers were noticed. The perpetrators sat in the dark, in the cold of late November, watching a portable television set, waiting for the precise moment to flip the switch. This brings us to the content of the message itself. Typically, broadcast intrusions are acts of aggression or absurdity. They are often political manifestos, obscenities, or surreal humor, such as the Max Headroom incident that would occur in Chicago a decade later. Those intrusions are characterized by their chaotic, jagged energy. The Vrillon broadcast was entirely different. The voice was synthesized, or perhaps an actor speaking through a heavy electronic filter, stripping away any recognizable regional accent. It was monotonous, rhythmic, and strangely soothing. It did not threaten. It did not demand surrender. The script, comprising roughly 600 words, was a pastiche of theosophical concepts and New Age terminology that had been percolating in the underground press since the 1950s. The entity identified itself as Vrillon, a representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command. This name, Ashtar, is a significant breadcrumb for the digital archaeologist. The concept of the Ashtar Command did not originate in 1977. It dates back to 1952 to a man named George Van Tassel. Van Tassel was an American aircraft mechanic and ufologist who lived in a cave under a giant boulder in the Mojave Desert. He claimed to be in telepathic communication with a space fleet overseen by a being named Ashtar. Van Tassel's movement was a fusion of Christian millenarianism and atomic age anxiety. The aliens were not invaders, they were guardians. They were concerned about humanity's development of nuclear weapons. They were here to save us from ourselves. By the late 1970s, these ideas had migrated across the Atlantic and mutated. They found fertile soil in the United Kingdom, where the decline of the British Empire had left a spiritual vacuum. The message broadcast over Southern television was a direct descendant of these desert prophecies. Listen to the specific phrasing used in the hijack. All your weapons of evil must be removed. The time for conflict is now past. We come to warn you of the destiny of your race. This is the language of high strangeness. It is bureaucratic, yet messianic. It treats the human population not as enemies, but as wayward children playing with matches. The message also contained a curious emphasis on truth versus dross. The voice warned viewers that there were false beings and that we must learn to be sensitive to the voice within. This turns the technological hijack into a philosophical lecture. The intruder used the ultimate tool of mass distraction, the television, to tell the audience to stop being distracted. It is a paradox. The hijacker utilized the very technology they seemed to critique. They interrupted a news broadcast, a recounting of human conflict and politics, to render it irrelevant. The reaction of the authorities further deepens the mystery. The Independent Broadcasting Authority, or IBA, was the regulatory body responsible for the transmitter. Their engineers were caught completely off guard. At the time of the broadcast, the Hannington site was unmanned. It was an automated outpost. The signal from Rorridge was received, amplified, and sent out. When the intrusion began, there was no red button to push. There was no engineer on site to pull the plug. The engineers at Southern Television's main studios in Southampton were helpless. They could see their monitors distorting. They could hear the alien voice. But because the hijack was happening at the relay point and not the source, they could do nothing but let it play out. They eventually attempted to cut the audio feed, but the capture effect meant the rogue signal was stubborn. It persisted. The intruder had effectively locked the door from the inside. In the days following the event, the IBA and the police launched an investigation. They combed the area around Hannington. They looked for tire tracks, for discarded equipment, for witnesses who might have seen a vehicle parked near the mast. They found nothing. The technical expertise required to build the transmitter narrowed the suspect pool significantly. This was not a job for a teenager. This required the skills of a radio engineer, a university student in electronics, or a military communications specialist. The UK in the 1970s had a thriving hobbyist culture. Amateur radio enthusiasts, or hams, were plentiful. The magazines of the era, such as Wireless World and Practical Electronics, were filled with schematics that, if modified by a creative mind, could theoretically produce the device used in the hijack. However, the specific frequency stability required to hold the audio capture for nearly 6 minutes suggests equipment that was better than a cobbled-together home kit. The frequency could not drift. If the hijacker's transmitter had wavered by even a fraction of a megahertz, the capture effect would have broken, and the audio would have snapped back to the newsreader. The signal remained rock solid. This implies high-quality components, crystal-controlled oscillators, a well-regulated power supply. This points to a perpetrator with access to professional-grade laboratory equipment or military surplus. And yet, despite the sophistication, the scope was intentionally limited. The signal only reached the reception area of the Hannington transmitter. It did not broadcast to the whole of London. It did not reach the entire United Kingdom. It was a local phenomenon, affecting perhaps tens of thousands of households in a specific slice of the home counties. There is an intimacy to this limitation. It feels less like a global proclamation and more like a test, a field experiment. Or perhaps it was simply that the perpetrator lived nearby. The media reaction was immediate but short-lived. The Sunday newspapers ran headlines about space hoaxes and Martian broadcasts. But the tone was one of bemused curiosity rather than genuine alarm. The police treated it as a nuisance, a breach of the Wireless Telegraphy Act, rather than an act of terror. But for those who sat in their living rooms that night, the experience was different. Imagine the setting. It is late November. It is pitch black outside. The heating is rattling. You are watching the news, the tether to reality. Suddenly, the image warps. The familiar voice of authority is silenced, and from the speaker comes a sound that is cold, metallic, and utterly devoid of humanity. This is the voice of Vrillon. For 6 minutes, the safety of the living room was breached. The television, usually a source of passive entertainment, became a conduit for something else. We must also consider the silence that followed. The perpetrator was never caught. No group came forward to claim responsibility. There was no manifesto mailed to the newspapers. No demands for money. Usually, a hoaxer wants the glory. They want the recognition of their cleverness. The silence of the Vrillon hijacker suggests a different motivation. Was the message itself the only goal? Did they truly believe in what they were broadcasting? Or was it an exercise in technical prowess? A challenge to the monopoly of the state broadcaster, proving that the airwaves could be seized by anyone with the knowledge to build the key. The 1970s were a time of freakers, people who explored the telephone network not to damage it, but to understand it, to map the hidden ghosts in the machine. The Hannington hijack feels like a spiritual ancestor to this hacker culture. It was an exploration of the vulnerability of the system. But the choice of the script remains the most haunting element. If one had the power to speak to thousands of people, why choose the words of an obscure 1950s UFO cult? Unless, of course, the purpose was to create a modern myth, to inject a virus of high strangeness into the bloodstream of suburban England. In the end, the context of the Vrillon broadcast is a perfect storm of technical vulnerability and cultural anxiety. It happened at the precise moment when the technology was advanced enough to be exploited, but primitive enough to lack security. It happened when the public was cynical enough to distrust the news, but hopeful enough to listen to a voice from the stars. The Hannington transmitter still stands today. The technology has changed. The signals are now digital, encrypted, and redundant. Such a hijack would be nearly impossible to replicate now, without leaving a massive digital footprint. But in 1977, for 6 minutes, the sky was open, and something stepped through. To understand the full weight of this event, we must now turn our attention to the message itself. We must deconstruct the manifesto line by line to see what it tells us about the mind, human or otherwise, that crafted it. That is where we will go in part 3. Part 3, the investigation. The screen returned to the Looney Tunes cartoon, but the atmosphere in thousands of living rooms across the southern television region had irrevocably shifted. The jovial antics of the animated characters now played out in a silence that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The static had cleared. The blue, wobbling lines of the interference had vanished. Yet the echo of that voice synthetic, calm, and utterly detached from the reality of a Saturday evening, lingered in the minds of the viewers. Almost immediately, the switchboards at Southern Television in Southampton lit up. It was a cacophony of confusion. Hundreds of callers flooded the lines, their reports varying wildly. Some claimed they had heard a warning of impending doom. Others believed they had witnessed a practical joke of sophisticated proportions. A few, perhaps more rattled than the rest, whispered that they had just received a transmission from a non-terrestrial intelligence. At the Independent Broadcasting Authority, or IBA, the panic was of a different nature. This was not just a disruption of a cartoon. It was a breach of national infrastructure. In 1977, the television signal was the primary artery of information. To hijack it was to demonstrate a terrifying vulnerability in the state's ability to communicate with its citizens. The investigation began before the final credits of the interrupted program rolled. Engineers at the IBA quickly isolated the source of the anomaly. It had not come from the main studios in Southampton, nor from the rebroadcast station in Dover. The signal had been injected directly into the transmission stream at the Hannington transmitter, located high on the North Hampshire Downs. Hannington is a classic example of a liminal space. It is a technological outpost situated in the rolling, ancient landscape of the English countryside. A metal spire rising from the chalk hills, surrounded by silence and wind. When the police and IBA engineers arrived at the site late that Saturday night, they found nothing. There were no broken locks, no cut fences, no van parked suspiciously in the lane with a wire running up the mast. The physical security of the site was intact. This absence of physical evidence forced the investigation into the realm of the invisible, the radio spectrum itself. The engineers deduced that the hijacker had utilized a technique known as an audio override. The television signal of 1977 consisted of two distinct parts: the video signal, broadcast on a specific frequency, and the audio signal, broadcast on a separate frequency nearby. The hijacker had not possessed the immense power or the complex equipment required to override the video feed. That would have required a transmitter the size of a truck and a power source to match. Instead, they had targeted the audio by transmitting a signal on the specific FM subcarrier frequency used for the sound, and by placing their transmitter relatively close to the Hannington receiver, perhaps within a few miles, they could exploit the capture effect of FM radio. In FM broadcasting, if two signals compete on the same frequency, the receiver will lock onto the stronger one and suppress the weaker one. The hijacker simply had to be louder than the signal coming from Southampton at that specific point of reception. This required technical competence, but not necessarily heavy industry. A knowledgeable radio amateur, or perhaps a student of electronics, could have constructed the necessary apparatus. A portable UHF transceiver, a frequency oscillator, and a directional Yagi antenna would have sufficed. The total kit could have fit in the boot of a car. This technical profile helped the authorities narrow down their suspect pool, or so they thought. They were looking for someone with the skills of a broadcast engineer, but the motivation of a prankster. The police inquiries were quiet but thorough. They interviewed local ham radio operators, the so-called rack chewers, who spent their nights scanning the airwaves. They looked into university electronics clubs in nearby towns like Basingstoke and Reading. They even scrutinized disgruntled former employees of the IBA. Yet every lead turned to vapor. There was no chatter in the underground radio communities. No one was bragging about the exploit. Usually, in the culture of phone phreaking and broadcast jamming, the glory is the currency. The hacker wants to be known, even if only by a pseudonym. But the voice of Vrillon remained unclaimed. The content of the message itself provided a baffling psychological profile. If this was a prank, where was the punchline? The message was nearly 6 minutes of rambling, philosophical discourse regarding peace, the removal of weapons of evil, and the dawn of the age of Aquarius. It lacked the jagged edge of political anarchism or the crude humor of a typical broadcast intrusion. It was earnest. It was boring. This brings us to the theories that have fermented in the decades since the event. The first and most persistent theory is the rogue engineer. This hypothesis suggests that someone inside the Hannington facility, or someone with intimate knowledge of the repeater network, staged the hijack. The precision of the frequency matching was nearly perfect. The audio drift, the moment where the cartoon sound faded out and the voice faded in, was handled with a smoothness that suggested a steady hand on a mixing desk or a very well-calibrated automatic system. However, the IBA maintained that the site was unmanned at the time, and their internal logs showed no unauthorized entry. The second theory dives into the subculture of ufology. In 1977, the UK was in the grip of a mild UFO mania. Movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind were on the horizon, released just months later. The specific vocabulary used in the broadcast, referencing the Galactic Command and Ashtar, aligns with a specific group of contactees active in the 1950s and 70s. The name Ashtar is a key piece of evidence. In the audio transcriptions circulating in the immediate aftermath, the entity identifies itself as Vrillon, a representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command. The figure of Ashtar Sharon was a staple of mid-century UFO cults, particularly those channeling messages from space brothers. However, a forensic listening of the surviving audio reveals a discrepancy. The voice does not clearly say Ashtar. It sounds more like Astarin or Gillen. The association with Ashtar might have been a case of auditory pareidolia, listeners projecting a known concept onto a garbled word. If the hoaxer was a devotee of these cults, they mumbled the most important name. If they were a satirist mocking the cults, they failed to enunciate the punchline. This ambiguity leads us to the digital archaeology of the event. How do we know what we think we know about this broadcast? The original master tapes from Southern Television do not contain the hijack. The intrusion happened over the airwaves after the signal left the studio. The only record of the event exists because of serendipity. A viewer somewhere in the reception area happened to be recording the audio of the broadcast, perhaps on a cassette recorder held up to the speaker or a direct line-out. This bootleg recording is the artifact we analyze today. It is a copy of a copy of a copy. In the digital age, this audio file has been compressed, filtered, and re-uploaded thousands of times. Each iteration introduces digital artifacts, blurring the original sonic fingerprint. When we analyze the audio spectrographically, we see a heavy amount of background noise and a distinct buzzing. This is consistent with an oscillator drifting slightly off frequency. But beneath the noise, the voice itself is heavily processed. It sounds mechanically altered, likely to disguise the speaker's identity. In the early 2000s, as the internet began to act as a repository for high strangeness, the Vrillon broadcast found a new life. It migrated from the pages of 40 Times magazine to Usenet groups and paranormal forums. Here, the investigation took on a new, crowdsourced dimension. Internet sleuths began to cross-reference the date, November 26th, 1977, with other events. They noted the proximity to similar broadcast intrusions in the United States, such as the Captain Midnight incident years later. But those were clearly identified hackers with grudges against cable companies. The Vrillon intruder had no demands, no ransom, and no ego. One intriguing, albeit unproven, lead emerged from these digital excavations. It involves the concept of masked masking. The theory posits that the message was a double bluff. The seemingly new age, hippie-esque content was designed to make the authorities dismiss the perpetrator as a harmless eccentric, rather than a dangerous radical testing, a weapon of information warfare. By framing the intrusion as nonsense, the hacker avoided a full-scale manhunt by the intelligence services, who might have been far more aggressive if the message had been political. There is also the decoy aspect of the digital footprint. Over the years, several recreations of the broadcast have appeared on video sharing platforms. These are modern fakes, often featuring clearer audio or different visuals. They muddy the waters, creating a layer of sediment that the digital archaeologist must scrape away to find the original, gritty, low-fidelity truth. We must also consider the silence of the perpetrator. It has been over 45 years. In most cases of high-profile vandalism or hacking, a deathbed confession eventually surfaces. A diary is found. A friend speaks up. My grandfather was Vrillon, but here there is nothing. This total silence suggests one of two things. Either the perpetrator was a lone wolf, completely isolated, who took the secret to their grave, or the group responsible was so disciplined, so committed to the reality of the message, that breaking character was unthinkable. The police files on the incident remain closed or lost to the bureaucracy of the era. The IBA was dissolved and replaced by new regulatory bodies. The Hannington transmitter still stands, broadcasting digital signals now, oblivious to the analog ghost that once haunted its frequencies. The investigation failed because it was looking for a criminal, but it encountered a phantom. The evidence is purely ephemeral radio waves that dissipated into space at the speed of light, leaving only a magnetic imprint on a few cassette tapes and a lasting scar on the memory of the southern television region. In the end, the most unsettling aspect is not the technology used, nor the identity of the user, but the motive. Why go to such lengths to tell the people of Berkshire and Hampshire to be still? The message was not a threat. It was a lullaby, and that is perhaps why it remains so effective. A threat would have been forgotten as a hoax. A lullaby, sung by a voice from the void, lingers in the subconscious. As we move to conclude our analysis, we must look at the legacy of this event, how it foreshadowed the era of fake news, deepfakes, and the fragility of our information systems. The Vrillon broadcast was a warning, not about galactic debris or false gods, but about the tenuous nature of the reality presented to us on our screens. The investigation is cold. The trail has vanished, but the signal is still out there, traveling away from Earth, past the orbit of Mars, past the asteroid belt, carrying the voice of the southern television hijacker into the very deep space they claimed to represent. In the final part of our dossier, we will synthesize these elements and ask the ultimate question. In an age of total connectivity, could Vrillon return? And if they did, would we even notice the static before the voice began? This concludes Part 3. Part 4. The aftermath. The static did not last long. At 1710, the invisible grip on the Hannington transmitter was released. The audio carrier wave, which had been forcibly suppressed, and replaced by the resonant, synthetic voice of Vrillon, returned to its natural state. The signal normalized. The Looney Tunes cartoon, which had been playing silently beneath the manifesto, regained its soundtrack. The animated violence of a coyote and a roadrunner resumed, as if the fabric of reality had not just been torn open for 6 minutes. For the viewers in Hampshire, Berkshire, and parts of London, the immediate sensation was one of dislocation. They had been sitting in their living rooms, the safest and most controlled environments in modern existence, and had been subjected to an intrusion that felt simultaneously technological and theological. The phones at Southern Television began to ring. They rang in the hundreds. Viewers were confused, frightened, or agitated. Some believed a genuine extraterrestrial contact had occurred. Others, perhaps more cynical, but no less disturbed, believed they had witnessed a coup, a terrorist takeover, or a government psychological operation gone wrong. This is where the event transitions from an active crisis to a cold case. This is where the signal ends and the noise of history begins. In the immediate wake of the broadcast, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, or the IBA, launched an investigation that was as frantic as it was futile. We must understand the era to understand the severity of the breach. In 1977, the television signal was the voice of the state and the voice of culture. There was no internet. There were only 3 channels. To hijack the audio feed of a primary transmitter was not merely a prank. It was an act of dominance. It demonstrated a vulnerability in the national infrastructure. Engineers and police descended upon the Hannington transmitter site. Hannington is a place of stark, industrial geometry set against the rolling, pastoral hills of Hampshire. It is a liminal space, a zone where the rural earth meets the electric sky. The investigators found the site physically secure. There were no broken locks. There were no cut fences. The equipment inside the bunker was humming, untouched. This absence of physical evidence forced the investigation outward, into the ether. The engineers deduced that the hijack had not occurred at the source, but near it. The perpetrator had likely positioned a rogue transmitter close to the Hannington relay, tuning it to the specific frequency of the UHF audio subcarrier. By pumping a signal with higher wattage than the incoming feed from Southern Television, they achieved what is known as the capture effect. The stronger signal suppressed the weaker one. This sounds simple in theory. In practice, in 1977, it required a level of sophistication that baffled the authorities. The equipment necessary to generate such a signal was not available at a local electronics shop. It would have been heavy, cumbersome, and required a significant power source. It would have required a knowledge of frequency modulation that was the domain of broadcast engineers, military communications officers, or perhaps the most elite tier of amateur radio enthusiasts. And yet, despite the technical footprint required, the perpetrator left no trace, no tire tracks in the mud, no witnesses reporting a van with an antenna parked on a ridge. The investigation, for all its resources, found nothing but the echoing silence of the Hampshire countryside. The media reaction was a predictable mixture of sensationalism and dismissal. The Sunday papers ran headlines about space hoaxes and little green men. They treated it as a novelty, a war of the worlds panic for the disco era. But looking back at the archival footage and the newspaper clippings, one detects an undercurrent of genuine anxiety. The anxiety stemmed from the content of the message. Most broadcast intrusions, both before and after the Southern television hijack, have been acts of ego or anarchy. The Max Headroom incident in Chicago, 10 years later, was a chaotic, stuttering display of absurdity. It was a prankster laughing at the system. The Vrillon broadcast was different. It was devoid of ego. It was devoid of humor. The voice did not ask for money. It did not threaten violence. It did not claim to be the new ruler of Earth. It simply asked humanity to be better. It spoke of peace, of the removal of weapons, of a spiritual evolution. This benevolent tone is what makes the event linger in the mind. If this was a prank, where was the punchline? If it was a student hoax, why did no one ever come forward to claim the credit? Pranksters usually desire recognition. They want the world to know they outsmarted the system. The creator of the Vrillon tape has maintained a silence that has lasted nearly half a century. This discipline suggests a motivation that goes beyond mere mischief. Let us turn our attention to the artifact itself, the audio recording. As digital archaeologists, we are often left with copies of copies, data that has been compressed and degraded. The original recording of the Vrillon broadcast does not officially exist in the Southern television archives because the station itself did not record the intrusion. The station continued to record its own clean output. The evidence exists only because viewers at home, sensing something historic or terrifying was happening, held up cassette recorders to their television speakers. These amateur recordings are all we have. They are grainy. They are filled with the ambient noise of 1970s living rooms, the shifting of furniture, the gasps of families, the hum of the television set. This degradation adds a layer of hauntology to the event. The voice of Vrillon comes to us through a veil of magnetic distortion. It sounds distant, not just in space, but in time. The voice itself has been analyzed by audio engineers in the decades since. It is clearly a human male, speaking through some form of electronic processing to flatten the intonation and add a tremolo effect. The accent is difficult to place. It has the clipped precision of received pronunciation English, yet the cadence is unnatural, almost robotic. Some linguists have suggested the speaker was reading a script they had not memorized, leading to the odd pausing. Others suggest the voice was sped up or slowed down to disguise the identity of the speaker. The specific vocabulary used in the message provides another avenue of forensic analysis. The entity identifies itself as a representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command. This specific terminology links the broadcast to the subculture of UFO religions that were proliferating in the 1970s. The Ashtar Command was a concept that originated in the 1950s contactee movement, specifically through the writings of George Van Tassel. This connection leads to the most plausible, yet still unproven, theory that the broadcast was the work of a small, technically proficient group of believers, a sect that genuinely believed they were channeling a message from the stars, or who felt that humanity needed a shock to the system to wake up from its nuclear nightmare. If this theory is true, it reframes the event entirely. It changes it from a prank into a desperate technological prayer. It was a sermon blasted over the airwaves by people who looked at the Cold War, looked at the proliferation of evil, and decided to intervene using the only God that modern man listened to, the television. However, even this theory has holes. The UFO groups of the time were generally not known for their technical prowess in broadcast engineering. They were mystics, not hackers. The intersection of high-level radio frequency engineering and fringe esoteric belief is a very small Venn diagram. Today, the site of the intrusion, the Hannington transmitter, still stands. It is a functional piece of infrastructure, owned now by Archiva. It continues to beam digital signals across the south of England. If you visit the site today, you will find it remarkably similar to how it looked in 1977. The technology has shrunk, the racks of tubes replaced by solid-state blades, but the towers remain. It is a lonely place. The wind whips across the North Downs. The metal structures creak in the thermal shift. Standing there at the base of the mast, one cannot help but feel the weight of the unanswered question. The radio waves are invisible, passing through our bodies at the speed of light. We are constantly bathed in information. We cannot see or hear without the proper device. In the years since the broadcast, the internet has metabolized the Vrillon story. It has become a staple of creepypasta forums, YouTube investigation channels, and paranormal message boards. It has been mythologized. The transcript of the message is often misquoted. The duration of the event is exaggerated. This digital decay is ironic, considering the message warned against false signals. The event itself has become a signal obscured by noise. But there is a legacy here that is more profound than an internet ghost story. The Southern television hijack exposes the fragility of our consensus reality. We rely on authoritative sources to tell us what is true. We trust the news anchor. We trust the emergency broadcast system. We trust that the face on the screen is real and that the voice on the radio is sanctioned. When that trust is violated, when an unauthorized voice steps onto the stage and speaks with the authority of the infinite, it creates a crack in the world. For 6 minutes, the people of Hampshire did not know what was real. Was the cartoon real? Was the news real? Or was the disembodied voice speaking of the age of Aquarius the only real thing in the room? The content of the message. You must learn to be sensitive to the voice within is a Gnostic command. It asks the listener to reject the external illusion and seek internal truth. It is a subversive message to broadcast on a medium designed for passive consumption. Television demands we look outward. Vrillon demanded we look inward. As we conclude this deep dive, we are left with the silence that followed the transmission. The authorities never found the van. They never found the transmitter. The tape recordings were put in drawers and forgotten, then rediscovered, then digitized, then compressed. The people who sat in those living rooms are older now or gone. The world did not disarm. The weapons of evil were not removed. The new age of Aquarius did not dawn in the way the voice promised. Or perhaps it did, and we simply missed the signal. The mystery of the Southern television hijack is not who did it. The who is likely a mundane answer, a brilliant engineer with a strange sense of humor, or a devoted cultist with a stolen amplifier. The true mystery is the event's endurance. Why does it still unsettle us? It unsettles us because it represents the unknown knocking on the door of the known. We build walls of technology to keep the chaos out, to organize our lives into schedules and channels and frequencies. We believe that if we can measure the signal, we can control it. But the Vrillon broadcast is a reminder that the signal can always be overridden. It is a reminder that our control is an illusion. Somewhere in the background radiation of the universe, that signal is still traveling. Radio waves do not stop, they only attenuate. The voice of Vrillon, generated in a field in Hampshire in 1977, has now traveled 46 light years away from Earth. It is past the star Arcturus. It is moving out into the silence of the galaxy, a sphere of information expanding forever. To any entity listening in the deep dark, that 6-minute intrusion is now humanity's representative signal. It is traveling alongside our sitcoms, our news reports, and our wars. Perhaps, in the end, the message was not for us at all. Perhaps it was simply a message in a bottle, thrown into the electronic ocean, waiting for a shore that we will never see. Until next time, keep listening to the static. You never know who might be trying to break through.